There has been quite a debate among the Elden Ring community in regard to whether or not the Malenia fight is fair. The idea seems to be that if it's not fair, then it's a bad fight. And all of the community's efforts thus far have gone into proving whether or not Malenia adheres to the game's general mechanics. And I'm here to tell you that debate has long been settled. It's been proven that Malenia absolutely does not adhere to the general mechanics of the game. She breaks established rules and does things that other bosses simply can't do, like how her stance simply can't be broken while she's in hyper armor. No other boss or enemy in the game has that ability. The game absolutely sets you up to expect certain things from its enemies, and Malenia breaks those rules that the game previously established. So if that's what it means for a boss to be unfair, then I think you have a compelling argument that Malenia is in fact not fair. The question I'm here to ask is, does it matter that a boss is unfair? Honestly, I think the answer is no, at least not in this context. Malenia breaks the rules of the game, but you can't just remove her from the context within which she exists. Malenia is not a mandatory boss. You can beat Elden Ring's entire story without ever setting foot in the area that unlocks her. She is literally a hidden boss within a hidden dungeon within a hidden area that can only be unlocked by accessing two halves of a hidden item that you can only learn about after discovering a hidden quest. After all that, all it takes just to find her, if Malenia played by the rules, wouldn't that be a bit disappointing? I mean, I think the thing that people are failing to realize here is that there are no actual rules to a boss fight. I've seen this complaint levied against the bosses of Elden Ring in general, especially from fans of earlier entries in FromSoft's catalog. Mechanics like input reading have been heavily criticized, but I think the people looking at things this way are kind of missing the point. There are only so many ways that you could increase the difficulty of an enemy in a video game. One approach would be to increase things like damage dealt and how much health an enemy has. But if anything, these mechanics are actually a lot more unfair than things like input reading and hyper armor. The more health an enemy has, the more the fight just becomes a slog. There is inherently a limited amount of damage you are capable of doing in Elden Ring. No matter what your build is or how much you buff, you will eventually reach that maximum damage output. Now imagine for a moment that instead of Malenia being unable to have her stance broken during hyper armor animations, she instead required the player to reach that maximum damage output just to even make a dent in her health. That would of course be absurd. She already has tons of health after all, and it doesn't need to be buffed any further. A similar concept applies to how much damage she deals. The maximum amount of points you can put in Vigor is 99. There are then several talismans and runes you can use to further increase your health. Once again, let's imagine that Malenia required you to do such things just to survive a single hit. Would that be something the community wants? In fact, another way to increase the difficulty would be to flat out just make all of her hits one-shot you. That way you'd need to perfectly dodge her attacks, therefore invalidating the entire Vigor stat altogether. Something tells me most people wouldn't like that very much either. So then aside from buffing Malenia's attributes, what else could be done to increase her difficulty? Well, you could do things like give her unblockable damage. Even Waterfowl Dance, for as much as it's been criticized, is actually dodgeable. It's also completely blockable if you have enough stamina, so the alternative to that would be an attack that simply can't be blocked or dodged, or a string of hits that were even harder to avoid than Waterfowl Dance. But surely people wouldn't like that idea either, considering how much complaining there's already been about her kit. But there's another approach here we're not considering, and that is, instead of amplifying Malenia's attributes or making it harder for the player to actually engage with the fight, we could give her more options and a better ability to react to what the player does, effectively making her more human-like. This is something we see all the time in fighting games. When you fight a computer at the highest difficulty, oftentimes they're reacting to your inputs at inhuman speeds. It can even feel like you're going up against an impenetrable wall that adapts to everything you do. But there's also risk involved with this. The more perfect a computer is at reading your inputs, the more you can manipulate what it's going to do by baiting it into taking certain actions. That's how people beat computers in fighting games, so it's a bit of a balancing act. Still, I think this is a better option than the alternative, especially so in a game like Elden Ring, where inputs are often not cancelable. It's reasonable that in a fight, if an enemy saw you doing something that would increase your chance of killing them, then they would try to stop you. So Malenia could attack you during buffs, or whenever she saw you trying to prolong your life by healing, she would step in and make sure you were punished for it. Input commitment and punishments are a basic concept in things like fighting games, and Elden Ring shares a lot in common with that genre. Enemies, bosses in particular, have full strings of combos that you need to learn not just the timing to, but the startup and how much time you have once the animation is finished. That lets you know how many attacks you can get in before they start attacking you again. In that sense, Malenia actually follows all the same rules as every other boss in the game. You absolutely can learn her moveset. I'm really not that good at this game, and even I was able to eventually beat her without summoning. I also didn't have that many buffs, and my build probably wasn't optimal. And more importantly, I enjoyed every second of getting my ass kicked by her. Sure, I got frustrated at times, and I felt like some things were bullshit. But at the end of the day, I knew that my failed attempts to beat her were a result of poor decisions I was making. Sometimes I got greedy, or I succumbed to misinputs. Fighting Malenia and learning to adapt to her was the most rewarding experience I had in Elden Ring. And that's because I knew that she was designed as an adaptation herself. She is the result of FromSoft learning how players beat their bosses. She's meant to throw you off, to make you uncomfortable with what you've come to expect in these games. And that is exactly the reason people don't like her. That's the reason veterans of the Souls games in particular don't like her. I don't mean to be harsh here, but I've noticed a trend among the Souls community. Everybody wants to cling to "get good" as their mantra. A phrase like "not all games are meant for everyone" is worn like a badge of honor. And don't even get a FromSoft fan started on the idea of these games having a difficulty slider. But the moment their expectations are challenged, the moment their skill is tested, they crumble. So it's not that these players want to experience the game's difficulty as it's intended, like so many of them say they do. There is no sanctity of intention here. Instead, what they really want is a difficulty that caters to specifically them and no one else. And they don't want anything to do with the mechanics that the game gives you to make fights like Malenia's easier. They don't want to use Spirit Ashes. They don't want to have to summon another player to beat her. They want to be able to do it by themselves using self-imposed limitations. And fair enough, that's their choice. But for some reason, even though they're actively making that choice, if a boss is quote-unquote too hard, even if there's a dozen different things they could do to react to that difficulty, these players are still going to complain. It is beyond both amusing and frustrating to me that the community that for years has told others to get good is now whining about how difficult a boss is. Seriously, you can dodge Waterfowl Dance. Or God forbid you pick up a shield. God forbid the game asks you to play around something that you know is coming at some point. I mean, it's not like she just uses the attack over and over again endlessly. It has a cooldown. Does she do too much damage? Pump some points into your vigor instead of trying to beat the game with 25 invested in it. Or wear the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman that you conveniently get in the area right before you encounter Malenia. You're having trouble with your current build? Well, good thing there's an entire system built into the game to respec your character at any time. Or if you're really having trouble, you could try leveling up some more, or God forbid, summoning. Seriously, I have never seen so much entitlement and elitism baked into the criticism of a game's mechanics, especially not in regard to what ultimately amounts to one completely optional interaction. Believe it or not, you don't even have to fight her. That's the most amazing part. You can just choose to ignore her existence entirely. But you want to get all the achievements, and you want to experience the full content of a game that you paid $60 for. Well, I would say fair enough, but in your own words, games aren't meant for everyone, after all, and maybe you just need to get good. But there's another layer here that I haven't focused on as much as I'd like to, which is that even if Malenia were nearly impossible to beat, and even if you did need to be within the top 1% of players in terms of skill, the fact that she's a totally optional, hidden boss would still make that design choice justifiable. I mean, wouldn't it be kind of cool if there was a boss that only 1% of players could beat? Defeating them would be like a challenge run in and of itself. The issue I think people are running into here is that they don't want to play Elden Ring as it's intended. They don't want to learn the actual ebb and flow of the game. What they really want is to play Dark Souls again, and I'm sorry to be the one to have to tell you this, but that's probably never going to happen. FromSoft realistically has only two options here. They can keep retreading the same concept and design philosophies over and over again, or they can adapt and change things up to keep their audience on its toes. They've obviously chosen the latter, but people are still criticizing the game for being too similar to Dark Souls. And then they've got their core fanbase, which is also criticizing it for being too different. They literally can't win here. It's a total catch-22. But the funniest thing is, Dark Souls as a series has actually addressed this issue as part of its themes. One reading of the Painted World DLC would suggest that moving on from Dark Souls is not just something FromSoft wants to do, but it's also something that Miyazaki actively wants you to do as well. There's an excellent video by a channel called Ratatosker about this very concept, and I'll link that video in the description because it's absolutely worth a watch. And honestly, he does a much better job interpreting the themes of Dark Souls 3 than I'd be able to here. So all I'll say on that matter is this: you're never going to be able to play Dark Souls again for the first time. Searching for that sensation is a foolish endeavor, and I'm sorry for being harsh here, but it's the reality that we all have to acknowledge. There are plenty of stories that I wish I could re-experience for the first time, but I can't do that, and neither can you. But while that may seem like a curse, I'd like to argue that it's actually a blessing in disguise. You may not ever be able to play Dark Souls again for the first time, but you can take the lessons you learned from the series, internalize them, and move forward. But I'm afraid that a lot of the series' fans haven't internalized its messages. And if you're going to criticize Elden Ring, or any other game for that matter, then your criticism shouldn't stem from the wish that it were an entirely different game. Because at that point, you aren't actually engaging with the text, and nothing you say has any bearing on what the game is trying to do. Just remember, if you're going to criticize something, it's important to consider what it's trying to do, and to meet it on its own terms. Because if you aren't willing to even do that, to even give it a real chance to just be itself, then, honestly, what's the point?